The moment the woman I had brought to my ex-wife's wedding stood up in the middle of the reception and began to speak, every single person in that room went completely still. I need to tell you that I did not know she was going to do it. I want that on the record before anything else. I had brought her to that wedding for reasons that I will explain and that made sense to me at the time and that I believed were, if not entirely simple, at least honest. I had not brought her there for drama. I had not brought her there for a scene. I had brought her there because she had nowhere else to be and because I was a man who had learned, across 3 very difficult years, that the people who have nowhere else to be are sometimes the people who most need someone to think of them. What happened when she stood up was not what I expected. What she said when she stood up was not what anyone expected. And what came out of that speech, what it revealed, what it changed, what it set in motion that afternoon in a wedding venue in Atlanta, Georgia, is the story I am here to tell you today. So stay with me, because this one goes somewhere none of us saw coming. My name is Marcus Webb. I am 38 years old, a high school history teacher in Atlanta, and the single father of a 9-year-old girl named Amara, who is the most important person in my life, and who has been the most important person in my life since the morning she arrived in the world and looked at me with those enormous dark eyes, and I understood with the full force of absolute certainty that everything before that moment had been preparation and everything after would be purpose. Amara's mother is a woman named Celeste. Celeste and I were together for 6 years and married for 4 of those 6 years, and we were, during the good period of that marriage, genuinely good together in ways that I still honor even though the marriage ended. She is intelligent and driven, and she was a devoted mother to Amara in the years we were together, and she remains one now that we are not. Our divorce was not explosive. It was the quieter kind of ending, the kind that happens when two people grow in directions that stop overlapping and finally reach the point where staying requires more distortion of both selves than either can sustain. We parted without hatred and with the specific intention of protecting our daughter from the fallout of what we could not make work between us. I am telling you this because I want you to understand who Celeste is before I tell you about the wedding, and because I think the honest version of this story requires that I not make her a villain in order to make myself a hero. She is not a villain. She is a woman who made choices I did not always understand and who loved our daughter and who eventually found a man who fit her life in ways I had not and who decided to marry him. None of that is wrong, some of it hurt. Both of those things are true simultaneously. The man she decided to marry was named Broderick St. James, which is a name that sounds like it was invented for a man who wears his collar up, and I will admit that this observation says more about my feelings in the months leading up to the wedding than it says about Broderick, who is, by objective measure, a perfectly adequate human being. He is successful and attentive and treats Amara with appropriate warmth, and I have no specific grievances against him beyond the general grievance of being human and watching the person you once loved marry someone else, which is a grievance that belongs to you alone and that no reasonable person will validate. I was invited to the wedding because Amara was the flower girl and Celeste, with the specific graciousness that had characterized her approach to our co-parenting, had decided that it was important for Amara's emotional experience of the day that her father be present and that the day not become a source of confusion or hurt for our daughter. I respected that decision. I agreed to attend. I put on the suit I owned that still fit properly, and I arranged a rideshare, and I prepared myself for the specific emotional performance of a divorced father attending his ex-wife's wedding with sufficient dignity that his 9-year-old daughter would not have to manage any of his feelings while she was scattering flower petals down an aisle. What I had not prepared for was the phone call I received the morning of the wedding. The phone call was from my neighbor Mrs. Yvonne Collins, who was 72 years old and who had lived in the apartment 2 doors down from mine for the 3 years since I had moved out of the house Celeste, and I had shared and into the apartment that was the right size for a single father and his daughter, and that Mrs. Collins had made feel considerably less lonely by being the kind of neighbor who noticed things and acted on what she noticed. She called me at 7:30 in the morning and told me that there was a woman sitting on the steps outside our building who had been there since before sunrise and who had a garbage bag beside her that appeared to contain all her possessions and who had told Mrs. Collins, when Mrs. Collins had brought her a cup of coffee, that she had nowhere to go. I want to tell you what I did with that information because I think it reveals something about the person I had become in the 3 years since my divorce. The person that those 3 years of difficulty and single parenthood and learning to be present for my daughter in the full way she needed had made me. I put on my shoes and I went downstairs. The woman on the steps was named Diana. I will give you more of her story in a moment, but first I want to tell you what I saw when I came down the stairs and looked at her, because what I saw was important and because I want to be accurate about it. She was a black woman, perhaps 40, perhaps a few years younger. It was difficult to tell because the particular exhaustion she was wearing adds years to a face in ways that sleep and safety eventually remove. She was thin in the way that people are thin when meals have been inconsistent. She was dressed in clothes that had been clean once and had been kept as clean as was possible under circumstances that did not include reliable access to laundry. She was sitting very straight, which I noticed, the specific posture of a person who has decided that dignity is the one thing nobody can take unless you give it to them. She looked at me when I came out and she did not flinch or apologize or perform the specific performance of apology that people in her situation are often conditioned to produce for people in mine. She simply looked at me and said, "I'm not bothering anyone." I said, "I know, I brought you coffee." Mrs. Collins had given me the second cup she had prepared. She looked at the coffee for a moment, then she took it. She said, "Thank you." I sat down on the step beside her, not because I had a plan. I sat because she was sitting and standing over her felt wrong. Her name was Diana Ashworth. She had been a licensed clinical social worker for 11 years. She had lost her position 8 months earlier when the nonprofit she worked for lost its primary funding source and made sweeping layoffs. She had burned through her savings and her emergency fund in the months that followed, during which she had applied for more positions than she could count, had experienced the specific cruelty of a hiring market that responds to a woman who has been unemployed for 6 months by wondering why she has been unemployed for 6 months, and had eventually, 3 weeks before this morning, lost her apartment. She had been staying with friends and then with acquaintances, and then, as the social capital of crisis tends to deplete nowhere. I listened to all of this. I did not interrupt. I had been a high school history teacher for 12 years, and I had learned from my students the specific importance of letting someone finish before you respond, of treating what someone tells you about themselves as complete before you add your own words to it. When she finished, I said, "Do you have a safe place to go today?" She said, "Not currently." I looked at her. I thought about my day. I thought about the wedding I was attending in 4 hours. I thought about my daughter who would be there scattering petals and who would ask me later who I had brought with me because Amara asked about everything with the specific comprehensive curiosity of a 9-year-old who has decided that information is important and that adults are the primary source of it. And I made a decision that I want to be honest about. It was not purely altruistic. It was partly altruistic and partly the decision of a man who had been dreading attending his ex-wife's wedding alone for 3 months and who had just been presented, by the specific timing of the universe or chance or whatever you prefer to call it, with a reason to not walk into that venue by himself. I am being honest about this because I think the mixed motives are important and because pretending my motives were simpler than they were would be a disservice to the truth of what happened. I said, I'm going to a wedding this afternoon. Would you like to come with me? She looked at me. She was clearly trying to determine what this offer was and what it was not. I understood that. A woman who has been in her situation learns with urgent necessity to read what is behind an offer. I held her gaze steadily because I had nothing to hide and I wanted her to be able to see that. She said, "Why?" I said, "Because I would rather not go alone and because you need somewhere to be today and a wedding is somewhere." She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "Whose wedding?" I said, "My ex-wife's." She blinked. Then she said, "That is either the healthiest thing I have ever heard or the strangest." I said, "Probably both." She was quiet for another moment. Then she said, "I don't have anything appropriate to wear." This is where Mrs. Collins, who had apparently been watching from her doorway since I sat down, stepped in. She said from behind her partially open door, "I have 3 daughters. I have things that might work. Come inside." Diana looked at me. I shrugged. She looked at Mrs. Collins. Then she stood up, picked up her garbage bag, and went inside. I want to skip past the next 2 hours in some ways because they were primarily logistical, and also because they belonged to Diana and Mrs. Collins, and the specific warmth of Mrs. Collins's apartment. And what happens when a woman who has been sleeping outside for portions of 3 weeks is allowed to shower with real hot water and shampoo, and to look at herself in a mirror without the weight of the street on her face. But I will tell you the result, which is that Diana Ashworth came out of Mrs. Collins's apartment 2 hours later in a deep green wrap dress that fit her well because Mrs. Collins's middle daughter had been about her size some years earlier, with her hair arranged with the help of Mrs. Collins's surprisingly comprehensive collection of products, and she looked like herself, not a dressed-up version of someone else. Herself, with the exhaustion lifted for a few hours by hot water and care. She looked at me in my suit and she said, "We are going to your ex-wife's wedding." I said, "We are," she said, "all right then." We took a rideshare to the venue. During the ride, she asked me about the wedding, about Celeste, about Amara. I told her. She listened the way someone listens when they have been trained to receive people's stories, with genuine attention and the specific quality of a person who is interested in the actual content rather than just waiting for their turn. I told her about the divorce and about Amara and about the 3 years of co-parenting and about the specific emotional complexity of today. She said, "That is a lot to carry." I said, "It gets lighter." She said, "Does it?" I said, "Ask me again in a year." She smiled. It was the first smile I had seen on her, and it changed her face in the way that a smile changes a face when it has been absent for a while, the specific illumination of a feature returning to function. The venue was beautiful. A historic mansion in Buckhead with gardens and white chairs, and the specific curated loveliness of a wedding that has been planned by someone with excellent taste and sufficient resources. Celeste had both. The guests were arriving in the warm late morning light, and I navigated the parking area and the greeting tables with Diana beside me and introduced her simply as Diana, a friend, and nobody asked follow-up questions because nobody at a wedding asks follow-up questions. Amara found me before the ceremony. She came running in her flower girl dress, white with small yellow flowers, and launched herself at me in the specific way of 9-year-olds who have decided that a running hug is the appropriate greeting regardless of the social context. I caught her and held her and she said into my shoulder, "Daddy, you came," as if this had been uncertain, which it had not been but which I understood was the expression of a child who needed to feel her father present at a day that was complicated for her too. I set her down and she looked at Diana with the direct assessment of a 9-year-old who has decided that all adults in her father's company are subjects for evaluation. She said, "Who are you?" Diana crouched down to Amara's level, which I noticed and which told me something about her professional training and her character simultaneously. She said, "My name is Diana. Your dad was kind enough to invite me today. Are you the flower girl?" Amara said, "Yes, I practiced walking slowly." Diana said, "That is the hardest part." Amara considered this. Then she said, "You can sit with Daddy. which was both a permission and an instruction, and she went back to where Celeste's family was gathering. The ceremony was beautiful. Celeste was radiant in the specific way that people are radiant when they are doing something they have chosen completely. Broderick cried, which I will admit I had not expected, and which recalibrated my assessment of him slightly upward. Amara walked slowly and scattered her petals with the concentration of a professional. I sat in the third row with Diana beside me and I watched my daughter do her job beautifully, and I felt, without expecting to feel it, something close to peace. At the reception, I introduced Diana to a few people I knew from the years of Celeste's family and friends, and I watched her move through those interactions with the ease of someone who has spent years professionally putting people at ease. She was warm and present, and she asked good questions, and she remembered names, and she was, by any observable measure, the most socially skilled person in the room. I found myself watching her and thinking about what she had told me on the steps this morning, about the 11 years of social work, about the families she had helped navigate crisis, about the professional expertise sitting inside a woman who had been sleeping outside 3 days ago because a nonprofit's funding had dried up, and the hiring market had decided her gap year was a character flaw. I was thinking about this at our table during the dinner service when Celeste came over. I want to describe this interaction carefully because it matters for what follows. Celeste was gracious and warm, and she thanked me for coming, and she told me Amara had been wonderful, and she looked at Diana with an expression of polite curiosity and said, "I don't think we've met." Diana said, "No, Diana Ashworth. Marcus was kind enough to bring me today." Celeste looked between us with the specific expression of an ex-spouse doing rapid assessment. She said, "Are you two together?" I said, "Diana needed somewhere to be today and I needed company." It worked out. Celeste looked at me for a moment with an expression I could not read cleanly, then she smiled and said it was lovely to have her there and moved on to the next table. Diana looked at me after she left and said very quietly, "She's still in love with you." I said, "That's not true," she said. "I've been a social worker for 11 years. I know what I see." I decided not to pursue that line of conversation. The moment that changed everything happened approximately 45 minutes into the reception, during the portion of the evening when guests were invited to share toasts and words for the couple. Several people had spoken. Broderick's best man, Celeste's sister, a college friend, when Diana, who had been sitting quietly beside me for the previous 20 minutes, stood up. I looked at her. She was not looking at me. She was looking at the room with the specific focused composure of someone who has decided to do something and has moved past the decision into execution. I said very quietly, "Diana," she said equally quietly, "trust me." And she began to speak. What she said was this. She thanked Celeste and Broderick for the beauty of the day and for the warmth of the welcome she had received as an unexpected guest. She said she hoped they would forgive a stranger for speaking at their wedding, but that she had been sitting with something for the past several hours that she could not leave the room without saying. She said she had met Marcus Webb on the steps of an apartment building this morning when she had nowhere to go, and that he had given her coffee and sat beside her and listened to her story and then invited her to share this day with him. She said she wanted to say something about that, but also something more than that. She paused. The room was completely still. She said she had been a licensed clinical social worker for 11 years before losing her position 8 months ago to funding cuts. She said she had spent 8 months trying to re-enter her field and had found every door either closed or taking longer than her resources could sustain. She said that in those 8 months she had developed a program proposal. In the hours she spent in libraries because they were warm and had Wi-Fi, for a community mental health initiative specifically designed for families navigating separation and divorce in under-resourced communities. She said she had the expertise to run it and the research to support it and the passion to build it, and she had not been able to find anyone willing to take a chance on a 41-year-old social worker with an employment gap. She looked at Celeste. She said, "I know this is your wedding day and I know this is unusual, but you are a woman who everyone in this room clearly loves for your generosity and your intelligence. And the man who brought me here today is a single father who has been raising your daughter with a grace and a dedication that everyone at this table has described to me in the past 2 hours without him asking them to. I don't know what your marriage ended for, and that is not my business, but I know what good people look like. I am looking at two of them in this room, and I think the world needs more of what both of you have to offer." She sat down. The room was absolutely silent. And then Celeste's mother, a woman named Adiz who had always been warm to me and who was sitting 3 tables away, began to applaud, slowly. And then the table beside her, and then the whole room. I looked at Diana. She was looking at her hands in her lap. Her jaw was tight. She had said what she needed to say, and now she was sitting with the aftermath of it. I said very quietly, "Where did that come from?" She said equally quietly, 11 years of watching people miss each other across rooms because nobody said the thing that needed to be said. What happened next surprised me more than the speech. Celeste came to our table, not at the end of the reception. Within 10 minutes of Diana sitting down, she came and she sat in the empty chair on Diana's other side and she said, "Tell me about this program." Diana looked at her. I looked at Celeste. Celeste was looking at Diana with an expression I recognized from our marriage as the expression she wore when she had encountered an idea that had landed in the specific place in her mind where good ideas land and started generating questions. Celeste, I have not told you yet, is the director of community partnerships at one of Atlanta's largest hospital systems. Her work is specifically the work of connecting community organizations and healthcare infrastructure for under-resourced populations. What Diana had described in her speech was, with a precision that neither of them had planned, exactly the kind of program Celeste had been trying to find an organizational partner for 18 months. They talked for 45 minutes at that table while Broderick, to his considerable credit, brought them both drinks and checked on them twice and told me, when I apologized on Diana's behalf for monopolizing his bride at their reception, that Celeste looked the most professionally alive he had seen her in months, and that he had married her specifically because she was the kind of person who would have a program development conversation at her own wedding, and that he would have been disappointed by anything less. I sat across from them and watched my ex-wife and the woman I had found on my steps this morning build something together in real time, and I felt a thing I had not felt in a while, which was the specific wonder of watching life move in directions nobody planned. 3 months after the wedding, Diana Ashworth began as the founding director of a new community mental health program housed within Celeste's hospital system. The program served families navigating separation and divorce in 4 Atlanta neighborhoods. By the end of its first year, it had served over 200 families and received a national recognition from a mental health advocacy organization that I will not name because Diana does not like to be made a story before the work is done. Her first hire, because she was allowed to hire 2 people, was a young woman who had been her former client years earlier, who had navigated a family crisis with Diana's help and gone on to complete a social work degree, and who was now, because Diana remembered her and called her, doing the work Diana had taught her. The funding that Diana had struggled to find alone materialized in the context of Celeste's hospital system's institutional infrastructure and relationships. The hiring gap that had been a liability became irrelevant in the context of the quality of what she had built and proposed. The proposal that had been received with polite inaction by organizations she had approached alone was received with serious attention when it arrived with the institutional backing of a major healthcare organization. Amara, who was present for portions of this story in the ways that children are present for adult realities without fully understanding them, asked me some months later why Diana came to Mama's wedding. I thought about how to answer that. I said that sometimes people end up in places they did not plan to be, and it turns out those places are exactly where they needed to go. Amara considered this for a moment and then said that she had ended up in my class at school once when she was supposed to be in art, and it turned out she liked history better. I told her that was basically the same thing. She was 9. I was not going to argue. Let me tell you what I learned from the day I found Diana on my steps and brought her to a wedding I was dreading and watched her stand up in a room full of strangers and say the thing that needed to be said. What I learned is something I should have already known as a history teacher, which is that the turning points are rarely where we expect them. The thing that changes everything is rarely the large planned event. It is almost always the small unplanned one. The step you sit down on because standing over someone feels wrong. The coffee Mrs. Collins had ready. The woman who looks at a room and sees what needs to be said and says it. I learned that the people we dismiss as having nothing, who are reduced in our social imagination to their circumstances rather than their substance, are carrying things that the world needs and has simply failed to create the conditions to receive. Diana Ashworth spent 8 months being told in various ways by various hiring processes that she was not what was needed right now, when what she was carrying was precisely what was needed. And what changed was not Diana, but the conditions in which Diana was encountered. I learned that doing a generous thing for mixed motives is still a generous thing. I sat on those steps partly for Diana and partly for myself, and the result was the same as if it had been purely for Diana. The universe, in my experience, does not penalize mixed motives, it penalizes inaction. So I learned that my ex-wife is a remarkable woman who became even more remarkable to me on the day of her wedding to another man than she had been to me in the years of our marriage, which is its own complicated thing to sit with, and which I am still, honestly, sitting with. And I learned that Amora, my daughter, who scattered her petals carefully and walked slowly and practiced exactly as she had been taught, and who looked up at me from the aisle with that specific expression that 9-year-olds have when they want to make sure you are watching, is the finest thing I have ever had anything to do with, and that whatever I needed to go through to be her father was worth every step of it. If this story reached you today, if anything in it felt true or felt like something you needed, I am asking you to do one simple thing. Subscribe to Black Diamonds right now and hit the notification bell. Because we are here every single week with stories exactly like this one. Stories about the turns nobody planned, the people and places they did not expect, the days that seem like one thing and turn out to be another. You do not want to miss what is coming. And in the comments right now, I want your name and your city, just those two things. Because this channel reaches everywhere and every single person watching is a person who has sat on some version of a step and made some version of a decision about what to do next. Drop your name and your city. I read every comment, every one. My name is Marcus. I am telling you this story from Atlanta, Georgia, where I teach history to 16-year-olds who sometimes think history happened to other people in other times, and where I try every day to show them that history is happening right now and that they are the ones making it, whether they mean to or not. Diana sends her regards. She is too busy to be in this story right now. The work is good. Next week on Black Diamonds, I am going to tell you about a woman who showed up to her own job interview and discovered that the person interviewing her was the husband who had told her she was not capable of working at that level. What she said in that interview room, what he did when she sat down across from him, and what the hiring committee decided when they saw what happened between them. Subscribe right now, turn on your notifications. I will see you next week. The steps outside your building are not just steps. Sometimes they are the beginning of something nobody has a name for yet.